So it looks like we're recording, and I'll let everybody in here. Let's see. So we can see the attendees on the side. We've got some people joining here. Hello, everyone. We're just going to let people join here for a couple minutes, and then we'll get it going. Prompt participants, they're all jumping in here, all on time. Wonderful. It's exciting to see so many names. All right, everyone, that looks like a good amount of people. I'll get started. My name is Michaela Harder. I'm the site supervisor for the Sibley Historic Site. I'm here with Jayne Becker this evening. Thank you for joining us. And I am going to share my screen so you can get a little intro into this program here. All right. There we go. So welcome. We have a presentation on Sibley and Ramsey. They were rivals and allies. Our presentation is by Jayne Becker, and it is hosted by the Friends of the Sibley Historic Site. If you haven't done a webinar before, if you're here and you're signed in and you can see us and hear us, you're doing great. Since we can't hear you, if you want to throw a comment in during the presentation or a hello or whatever you would like, at the bottom of your screen, there's an icon that says chat right there. You can type into there and share what you would like. If you have a question during the presentation and don't want to forget, click the question answer icon and type that in and send it in right away. At the end, we'll have time for question and answers. But it's always great to get the questions in right away because then we don't have to wait to gather all the questions before we start answering. And this presentation would not be possible if it wasn't for the Friends of the Sibley Historic Site. They are a great asset to us. They support us and they help us achieve a lot of our goals and dreams. And they have sponsored the event for this evening. So thank you for that. And with that, I will give it to our guest tonight, Jayne.
Thank you, Michaela. I appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for, allowing me to join you this evening. Thank you for the invitation to join you tonight. I'm so glad we could make this happen. I know it took a lot of work on the other side for people like Michaela and Matt Carter and Bob Minish and other people with the Friends of the Sibley Historic Site. So I appreciate everybody's patience and flexibility that we, again, could make this work and still have ways of connecting with history in this history-making time that we are living through. I originally shared this presentation in May of 2019 at the Mendota After Hours event at the Sibley Historic Site in Mendota. And as much as we'd like to be there together tonight, we'll just cross our fingers and hope that we can be together again in person sooner rather than later for other future history presentations. And before I go any deeper, I wanted to take a second and share that this presentation grew out of research that I conducted for several years during my time with the Minnesota Historical Society, but specifically a lot of the time that I spent the years I spent at the Ramsey House in St. Paul. The site has such an incredible multitude of sources, primary source material. Everything pretty much was saved by the Ramsey family, including letters and journals by Alexander Ramsey and his granddaughters, Laura and Anita Furness, receipts, both food receipts, recipe receipts, cookbooks, but also bills of lading. We know so much about their lives and their hopes, their dreams, what happened in their lives. And over in whatever materials I was looking at, whether it was letters or journals, there were always so many references to Henry Sibley and his family. And there certainly were references to other Minnesotans, including, of course, other national figures and even international figures in many respects. But the references for the close relationship and connections with the Sibley family always intrigued me. And part of the reason for that is I did spend so many years, as I already kind of alluded to, working for the Minnesota Historical Society. I spent 17 years with MNHS, interpreting history, teaching, designing and developing programs, day camps, you name it. I began my career at the Minnesota History Center in St. Paul, and then I worked as a program development specialist for a while. I also really, though, could flourish in the Museums and Historic Sites Network. And I worked for many years at Historic Fort Snelling, the Minnesota State Capitol, the Sibley site, and also then at the Ramsey House for over 14 years at the Ramsey House, part of that being an interpreter and then also as a site manager and supervisor. So with that being said, I wanted to share a little bit of that because I always mention to people, and some of you may have heard me say this, that I have been in the history and museum field since the ripe old age of 7 because I had a museum in my room when I was a child. And so I've always loved telling history, sharing stories from the past. And again, I appreciate this opportunity this evening. So let me share screen. Thanks for everybody's patience here as I bring up what I need to. And so my presentation tonight, Henry Sibley and Alexander Ramsey, Rivals and Allies, explores Henry Sibley and Alexander Ramsey from different perspectives. I wanted to highlight some of the context surrounding their relationships or relationship rather than simply the content. We hear a lot about the content, the dates, happenings, things like that. But so many times I feel that we forget some of the context about their relationship, their rivals, the rivalry and their allyship at times. So tonight, I wanted to focus on that because for 42 years, their lives intersected and their careers connected. Their rivalry and friendship at times was unique. And as a historian, it always strikes me how different history would be if some of the events that happened to them or that they took part in went a different way, or each of them took a different path and maybe never even had met. Fascinating to think about. I've always been fascinated by the fact their lives were so interconnected, whether through politics or organizations they served with, boards they served on, or even their family and their friends were so connected. So tonight I want to share more of the behind the scenes stories that don't always make it onto exhibit panels or into tour formats or written down on blog postings. So we'll dive in right away with Henry Sibley. Then we have kind of a list of some of the events in his life, certainly not an exhaustive list by any means, and I certainly know that. But the intention here again is to highlight a few of the ways that he built his career as he went forward. So we have a list here of a fur trader, well known in the American Fur Company, author, congressional delegate, first state governor of Minnesota, state legislator, general of the United States Army, St. Paul civic leader. Henry Sibley had a very illustrious career. And he was born in Detroit in 1811, born into a very well-known family. His father was well-known in the legal system. And education seemed very important to both his father and his mother, both his father Solomon and his mother Sarah. Because Henry had a very good education, learning Latin and Greek, studying to kind of start being a lawyer. But he realized, and some of you I'm sure know this, that just the outdoors was really where he was supposed to be. He enjoyed being outdoors, the natural environment, being around the natural resources. So at age 17, he told his parents he wanted to be outdoors and longed for a more active and stirring life. And this led him to start his career in the fur trade. So he worked in Sault Ste. Marie, Mackinac area in Michigan for a while. But then in 1834, I think this is a pivotal year. Now, there were many pivotal years for him and Alexander Ramsey, but 1834 seems to kind of set him on the path for coming out to the area that would then be known as eventually Minnesota Territory. So he decided to take a leap of faith and work with Hercules Dousman and Joseph Rolette, or Rolette Sr., as a partner with them. And 1834, so using that as kind of a jumping off year, that was important to him. It also was important to Alexander Ramsey. If the two of them may not have made the decisions that they did, our history here in Minnesota could have been a little bit different. Though the two didn't know each other in 1834, they both embarked on new endeavors. And for Sibley, it was a new job that kind of put him on the path to the laundry list we see here of his accomplishments, coming out to what would become Minnesota. For Ramsey, it was starting to study law, realizing he really was interested in learning the legal system, training to be a lawyer, going into politics, aligning himself with the Whig Party in Pennsylvania. So that's kind of when he started becoming a rising star. So now we have Alexander Ramsey, lawyer, congressman, first territorial governor here in Minnesota, mayor of St. Paul, state governor, US senator, secretary of war. Ramsey was pretty accomplished in his own right as well. And Ramsey was born in more humble beginnings than Henry Sibley was. Ramsey's father, Thomas, was a blacksmith who died when Alex was really young. And so little Alexander Ramsey, little Alex, was then sent to live with some of his relatives on his mom's side. And that could have been a good thing at that point, because he was going to be able to access the education that would later become so important to him. As I mentioned, that both men enjoyed illustrious careers, as we saw both of their some of their accomplishments that I had listed. Even though Sibley didn't necessarily want to become a lawyer or continue in that vein, the two men did have some similarities, so that when they met in 1849, I think that also helped solidify that foundation that they used for their relationship. They both had experience in the law, both trained for it in some way, both served in Congress. And so later on, those shared experiences I believe, helped form the basis for their friendship that at times, though, would of course become rivalry in Minnesota history. So I'm going to actually jump back to Henry Sibley for a second, because I wanted to mention that in March of 1849, when Alexander Ramsey would have been appointed our territorial governor, and he was going to be sent out to this area, there had been no plans put in place for a place of lodging for our new territorial governor. And that's where Henry Sibley stepped in. He was going to be making sure that the Ramseys had a good place to live, and they would be staying with him in Mendota. And I'll get to that in a second. The reason that Alexander Ramsey had been even thought of by President Zachary Taylor to be appointed the governor of the newly created Minnesota Territory, Ramsey had spent a lot of time campaigning for Zachary Taylor in 1848, the campaign year of 1848. And even just like we hear about today, those electoral votes can make all the difference. And it was many people in Taylor's campaign, including President Zachary Taylor, felt that it really was Alexander Ramsey that helped capture those really important electoral votes from the state of Pennsylvania. And in order to reward, I guess, offer some, a reward for that, that's when Taylor tapped Ramsey to be Minnesota's first territorial governor. Now, Alexander Ramsey and his wife Anna had a very nice existence, very comfortable existence, living in Pennsylvania. And so Mrs. Ramsey, and I want to mention this, Mrs. Ramsey, when she was told that she would be coming out to Minnesota Territory, is said to have exclaimed, "Minnesota? Where upon earth is it? Denmark?" A lot of times that quote is taken out of context. So when I'm able to use it, I want to use it, because Anna Ramsey, Alexander Ramsey's wife, was very, very well educated. She also, though, had a very good sense of humor. And though we do know she was not thrilled with having to uproot and come out to St. Paul in the Mendota area, an area she not only wasn't familiar with, but would not have some of the creature comforts that she had grown accustomed to. Many people, as I mentioned, in 1849 didn't necessarily have Minnesota Territory on their radar. And since this region, though, did have a few, opportunities, there were some people who, of course, were exploring and arriving in this area. working in the fur trade. And then, as I mentioned, they would be staying with Henry Sibley in Mendota. Now, Henry Sibley mentioned this in his biography, that was an unpublished biography, that where he wrote that I was the host necessarily of not only the many who bore letters of introduction to me, but of all genteel appearance, whose wandering propensities led them to visit this distant region, so that I had to provide food and lodging, such as they were, very frequently for 15 or 20 men at a time. As no charge was ever made, some of these strangers would prolong their stay much longer than their good manners, not to say decency, would dictate. A few of the notable personalities who stayed with Henry Sibley in Mendota included the explorer and astronomer from France, Joseph Nicolay, the explorer John C. Fremont, and the artist George Catlin. So in the spring of 1849, it was kind of natural that Henry Sibley would extend an invitation to Alexander Ramsey, that his family should stay in Mendota. And this is the letter that Sibley wrote to Ramsey, and it was dated May 24th, 1849. It was dated from Mendota, and it starts with, Sir, dear sir, as you will find it very difficult to get quarters for yourself and family at St. Paul in the present crowded condition of that place, it will afford me much gratification if you will come directly here and make my home your home for any length of time which may suit your convenience. We can only promise yourself and Mrs. R a hearty welcome and such poor fare as the country affords. I trust you will be fit to accept this invitation without any reluctance, except so far as it may interfere with other arrangements you may have already made and of which I am ignorant. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, H.H. Sibley. So, and it wouldn't actually just be Alexander Ramsey that would be joining Henry and his wife Sarah in Mendota. Alexander Ramsey would be traveling with his wife Anna and their little boy, Alexander Ramsey Jr., Alex's brother, Justice, who also was going to come to St. Paul and started doing real estate speculation, mining speculation, things like that. They also had a nursemaid, a nanny for their little boy, Elvina Seitzinger. So you were going to get several people that would be staying, not just the territorial governor and his wife and child. But it turned out to be a great opportunity for the families to get to know one another. And it seems again that that is really the time that they could start laying a foundation for their future time together. The two men did strike up a friendship. And part of this was also a critical time because Ramsey could learn from Sibley. Sibley could teach him some of the important people to know in the area, and also including letting Ramsey know how important the fur traders were to political political advantages in the area as well. Sibley told a friend in 1849 that, quote, our governor takes well with the people. He is a plain, unassuming man of popular manners and such good sense. So it shows again the two men were becoming friends and started to deeply respect one another as well, even though at times they weren't necessarily going to probably be aligning politically. On January 2nd, 1854, just as an example of some of the notations of the connections in Alexander Ramsey's journal that he noted, he mentions taking wife, child, and nurse up to Sibley at Mendota. So since that would be January 2nd, likely that would have been a New Year's visit, which was very, very popular in that era. Well, since we talked a little bit about the men, we don't want to leave out the first ladies, because not only are Anna Ramsey and Sarah Sibley so important to Minnesota history, but also I know like I was there, but from what I can tell from primary source materials, the two women were adored by their husbands. Both marriages were love matches. I think both of the women were considered that they were helpmates. I know definitely in the case of Alexander and Anna Ramsey, Alex really admired Anna, went to her for seeking advice at times. Maybe he didn't always take it, but he really he adored her. And I know in the case of Sarah and Henry, from what I gleaned or what I know, they had a very loving relationship as well. And I know in Divided Heart by Roy Gilman. She even makes the quote of a time when, I believe it was when Sarah was writing a letter or mentioning something to her sister, if I'm remembering correctly. And that quote always sticks with me, because Sarah mentioned to this person she was talking to or writing to about Henry that each day I love that man more and more. So that always makes my history heart happy. So I wanted to share that. Sarah and Henry, Sarah Jane Steele Sibley, met Henry through her brother. Again, family connections came to play. And Alexander Ramsey met Anna Ramsey through family connections as well. When Alex met Anna, he was a rising star in the Whig Party. He was a congressman representing Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C., and he had a chance to meet Anna at a party in Washington. Anna's dad was another congressman also working in DC. And so then that's how they ended up meeting. And I know that in the case of Henry and Sarah, kind of again, a family affair again, that it was through Sarah's brother Franklin, who had become friends with Henry, that Sarah and Henry could meet. And they got married in 1843. And then the Ramseys followed suit in 1845. Both of the women played really important roles in Minnesota history. A lot of it is also due to their love and their devotion to preservation causes. Sarah headed the Mount Vernon Ladies Association here in Minnesota, and Anna worked with the Colonial Dames Organization and also traveled to Mount Vernon while it was undergoing restoration. The Minnesota Historical Society has so many of those letters and records in their archives, and it's really fascinating. So I at least wanted to mention them because they were very important to their family and to Minnesota history. So if we then take a look at as the years would go by, so for Ramsey and Sibley, governor and delegate, they both served in these positions as territorial governor and territorial delegate from 1849 until 1853. And that could be another reason that they developed such a bond through, again, that shared experience. Ramsey could depend on Sibley. Sibley had to depend on Ramsey. And Sibley likely knew the important role that he played, not only for the territory, but for Ramsey as well. And as I kind of looked into that era more when I was putting this presentation together, it came to mind, and I had looked at those dates before, but didn't really think about them. So for the whole entire time that Ramsey was territorial governor, Sibley was his congressional delegate in Washington. And that would make a big, it would be a wonderful thing to have, that continuity as you're serving together. And I think you could really start to build a team. Maybe we've all had that in work people or in work colleagues, where you can develop a team, you know that you work really well together, they can read your mind, you can read theirs, they bring out good sides of you. And I think that's what was starting with Sibley and Ramsey at this point in time. For instance, part of their routine would be Sibley would have to send back correspondence to Ramsey here in Minnesota pertaining to everything from business with the design of the territorial seal, bills for railroad and education land grants, military protection for the frontier, construction of roads and public buildings, and even letters dealing with the territorial budget. And I think, again, that all helps solidify their roles and reliance upon each other. So, which would also come into play very soon, because keeping those matters in mind that I mentioned, railroads, infrastructure, other official responsibilities that would pull both of them in different ways, maybe working on the same project, but looking at it from different angles, would be then in 1851 and the treaty signings, treaty negotiations with the Dakota, the treaties of Traverse des Sioux and the Treaty of Mendota. And as Ramsey, as territorial governor, he was also superintendent of Indian affairs. That would have been part of his role. And so he would have been a key figure in the negotiations, and Sibley would have been a key player as well. He still had some stakes in the fur trade, so that would be an important role for him to play. He'd want to be involved because of that. He also, as the congressional delegate, he'd want to be a part of that as well. That would be part of his role and responsibility. So keeping that in mind, it was important that they both were part of it, because in the eyes of the US government, that would be a really important task. Probably a very urgent task, and that was to accomplish these land negotiations and, to be honest, to remove the Dakota and Ojibwe people from the land and open it for settlers who were flooding in the territory. when the treaties were signed, there were different allegations of fraud, and the US Senate started digging deeper into these allegations. And that's actually what kept Ramsey in Minnesota, even after his time as territorial governor was over. And he even alludes to that in his journals, that if it was not for the business of the Senate, he would have already gone back east and continued his career out there. Now, both Sibley and Ramsey were exonerated in 1854 by the Senate, so I want to be very clear about that. But different allegations of underhandedness, of bullying, of bait and switch with the Dakota did dog both of them, or specifically Ramsey, for numerous years in his career. Okay. But it wasn't going to necessarily keep them from going forward in their careers. And one of the things that I wanted to mention was also the election of 1857. Pardon me as but that would be a critical year, not only for Minnesota, but also for Henry Sibley and Alexander Ramsey. 1857, a lot was happening in the country. You have the Dred Scott decision, where essentially if you were not white, you had no rights in the United States. There was a financial panic going on that not only affected the nationally, but did impact parts of Minnesota Territory as well. Bleeding Kansas, the decision, can Kansas become a state? Will it become a state? Should it be a free state? Should it be a slave state? And even here in Minnesota, we were approaching statehood, and that meant a gubernatorial campaign. On the screen, you'll see I have the quote, hot and bitter, and I'll explain why in a second. You also see on the screen, a map of the Minnesota Territory, what that would have looked like in 1857. And as we were approaching statehood, both the Democratic Party and the newly emerging Republican Party here in Minnesota wanted to strengthen their holdings. They knew that felt that whichever party won that first gubernatorial election, that was going to pave the way for the years going forward. Again, that would be a foundation to build on, and they wanted to capitalize on that. Both Alexander Ramsey and Henry Sibley entered the race, Sibley as a Democrat, Ramsey as a Republican. Ramsey originally had been a Whig, but he cast his lot in with the newly emerging Republican Party. He did attend some meetings of the Democratic Party earlier on, because he makes notations of that in his journal, but the longer he thought about it, he decided to cast his lot in with the Republicans. Part of it was he'd also been asked to head a committee for the Republican Party here in the St. Paul area, trying to get John C. Fremont elected, and a few years earlier. So a little backstory to that. But I wanted to use this quote because there's a great resource, and you can even find it online. You can Google it. It's called Mythical Cities of Southwest Minnesota by Robert Forrest. And it's all about the election of 1857. And one of the quotes to pull out of there, as this author is reliving the election of 57 here in Minnesota, that stuck out to me. He uses the term hot and bitter. Of course, my intention tonight is not to be partisan at all. I know we're also going through an election. I'm thinking of 1857, but I think some of the language might even strike similar tones today, just because of the divisiveness. I'm a civics geek. I love civics. Divisiveness is not the best. But this is a quote from the Mythical Cities of Southwest Minnesota. Not often, if ever, in the history of Minnesota has partisan politics been so active as it was in 1857. Minnesota was about to be born as a state, and the rivalry of Democrats and Republican leaders for control of the new state government was hot and bitter. There was the Constitutional Convention, which opened in mid-July. It was marked by skirmishes between parties intended to strengthen party lines. Party conventions followed the Constitutional Convention. And this author goes on to kind of detail what exactly happened. So I'll kind of sum it up there. But for a little background, the election was going to be held on October 13th of 1857. So campaigning had started. And when Sibley and Ramsey were going around the state campaigning, yes, you can see here, these are some notations from Alexander Ramsey's journal and his campaign, some of his campaign stops, I should say, in October of 1857, leading up to the election day. So one of the things that sticks out here as you're reading through, I'm assuming you probably recognize some of the cities. He mentions Ulm, New Ulm, Mankato, Owatonna, Faribault. So many of them were in the Minnesota River Valley or southern Minnesota. Ramsey was very popular with a lot of the immigrants in those communities. Many of them were German immigrants. Ramsey, because of his mom's side being German, spoke fluent German. So that endeared him to a lot of those people. Sibley, on the other hand, spoke French fluently. So that endeared him to still people working in the fur trade, even though that was kind of easing out at that point. But there's been different historians who have said that Ramsey spoke the language of the new voters and Sibley spoke the language of the older voters, the previous voters. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And so they were around campaigning, and I do have some then newspapers that show kind of some of the things that were going on. Because to help spread the word about their party platforms, both the Democrat and Republican parties had newspapers, very partisan organs that were really, it was their sole job to toe the party line. Newspapers were very partisan in the 1800s. The Minnesota Republican Party had a newspaper called the Minnesotian, and that was their mouthpiece, I guess, while the Democrats had the Pioneer and Democrat. In 1857, the year of the election, Earl Goodrich was the editor of the Pioneer, and Thomas Foster was the editor of the Minnesotian. And Thomas Foster was a really good friend of Alexander Ramsey, by the way. They had a falling out years later, but in 1857, Foster was supporting Ramsey all the way. Now, the newspaper I have up is from the Stillwater Messenger from Stillwater, Minnesota, and it was printed on the 13th of October, reminding everybody to go and vote. But you may be noticing, look out, fraud and deception contemplated. People were being warned on both sides that there essentially would very likely be shenanigans pulled. Ramsey and Sibley tried to stay above the fray and not cast in any of that mudslinging. But there were people on both sides that were really using very, I'm just gonna say disturbing language is the only one that comes to mind, very divisive language, making sure people knew that you had to toe the party line, vote the party ticket, and also encouraging people to be watchful at the polls because there could be ballot boxes stolen, ballot boxes stuffed, things like that. Another paper I have is then from later October, because what was happening, there were a lot of allegations of fraud, and as the clock ticked down on October 13th, though, we didn't know who had been elected. That would drag out for several days. So there's a quote from Alexander Ramsey's brother. So here we go, I want to put that in here. There were some shenanigans that were going, the reason eyebrows were being raised. Election day, October 13th, 1857, early returns favored Ramsey. In fact, most Eastern newspapers thought he would win easily. He had the name recognition, he had been territorial governor, they thought he had it in the bag. They started to call the election early. Since Republican strength lay in the settled areas, more like around New Ulm, Mankato, some of those places I mentioned, and the cities, Ramsey seemed assured of a victory. At first, Ramsey was in the lead, but that changed though. And as election returns came in, it changed, and it revealed almost a dead heat between Ramsey and Sibley. When the areas around Pembina, my screen, maybe it's too far back, but I want to show, so the area around Pembina, in what we would call North Dakota. But when those returns were coming in from Pembina and also from some 4 counties in southwestern Minnesota, Rock and Martin and Cottonwood and Murray, all the votes from those areas were coming in for Sibley. And not just a few coming in for Sibley or more than Ramsey, really there were no votes for Ramsey. And that started to raise some eyebrows in St. Paul. It was just a little odd that no one, or that Ramsey was getting 0 votes from those areas, not even 1, not even 2. So charges of fraud were already being hurled from both sides. One incident which bothered many showed a vote tally of 316 for Henry Sibley and 0 for Ramsey. This was starting to become common in the next few days from these 4 counties and Pembina up in northern Minnesota. People thought it was strange. On October 31st, 1857, the Minnesotian declared that Ramsey had won. They were wrong. So another paper, not only the newspapers, here we go, not only the newspapers on the East Coast were calling it, The Minnesotan, the Republican newspaper, had called it for Ramsey as well. The vote counting dragged on until November. And here, the Stillwater Messenger on October 27th is kind of saying the same thing. We think we are safe in claiming the election of Alexander Ramsey. We're going to go ahead and do this. They were wrong too, as we know. The Minnesotan and Pioneer and Democrat published articles finally just asking, who is our governor? This was becoming embarrassing for Minnesota. Residents were becoming embarrassed by the scandal. Politicians were becoming embarrassed. Both parties were very vocal in accusing the other one of rigging the election. One article from the Minnesotan reported that it had been seen that a thief had walked right into a polling place and had taken a Ramsey ballot box right out in front of them. The Pioneer and Democrat scoffed and then wrote that the incident had really been a Sibley box being stolen. The Minnesotan was the first to shout fraud. There's a letter, this is what I was thinking of and wanted to share. Alexander Ramsey's brother, Jonathan, lived in St. Paul, and he was keeping their family back east apprised on what was going on. This is a letter from December 18th, 1857. December 18th, way after the election. We still don't know who the governor is. So Alex's brother-in-law writes, quote, "Thine letter of the first was received yesterday, and as this is a dull, stormy evening, I will endeavor to write thee a few lines to pass the time. But I am afraid that I cannot give thee much news, but I expect the first thing thee will want to know is who is governor. I am sorry to say it looks rather bleak for Alex. There has been so much skullduggery and having so many Democrats at the head of government that they have determined to give it to Sibley. All the ballots and returns have come in, and they have given Sibley a 17-vote majority, and he insists on having his certificate. And since the governor is a Democrat, territorial governor Samuel Maderi, of course this will happen. It hardly begins to come up with the outrageous frauds carried out here by the Democrats. But how is it to be helped when they are bound to have the ruling power? But this election will not end here. The Republicans want Alex to contest it, and I think he will do it." He did not. A canvassing board was made up, and they did decide, of course, to award the certificate to Henry Sibley. Supporters urged Ramsey to fight. He said, I'm not going. He thought about it, but then he said, you know what, I'm not going to do it. He did have his lawyer look at the returns. He just realized in the long run, it was not worth it. But the interesting thing is, as you look through his journals, it still comes up over and over for him, whether it's people mentioning to him that, you know, you should have fought harder 10 years ago or 20 years ago. In fact, in 1877, so 20 years after that election, he still mentions it in his journal. And he mentions that he had talked to Henry Rice, who I know usually fell out with Henry Sibley too. Henry Rice mentioned to me, this is in 1877. Henry Rice mentioned to me, as he did for some years, that after the gubernatorial election of 1857, and upon the widespread order of fraud at a meeting of the leading Democrats in St. Paul, Rice said he proposed to Sibley and the rest that the question of the election be submitted to a conference, 2 to be selected by Sibley, 2 by Ramsey, and if necessary, a 5th. And that Sibley at first assented, whereupon Gorman, Willis Gorman, denounced the proposition and Sibley withdrew his assent. Rice says there was no doubt about the frauds, that I was elected by at least a majority of 1,000 votes. We don't know if that's right. Again, that might have been a time that Henry Rice and Henry Sibley had a falling out again. Sometimes that happened. But it's just, I think, interesting to note that in 1877, people like Henry Rice, Alexander Ramsey, Willis Gorman, they're still talking about this election from 20 years earlier. So again, if history had gone a different way, it would have been very interesting. And this has been one from finally November 12th, 1857. It would be keeping people up to date on the vote counts. And that was from the Southern Minnesota Star. So Sibley became governor. Ramsey did not. But he would try again a few years later and then be successful. I wanted to mention this for just a moment because this case is a fascinating part of Minnesota history and not everybody is aware of it. But the Bilansky case impacted or had at moments impacted both Henry Sibley's gubernatorial term and Alexander Ramsey's gubernatorial term. And It's also important to note that an important anniversary of this case happened just a few months ago in March. So in March 2020, that marked 160 years since the execution of St. Paul woman Anne Bilansky, the only woman ever legally executed by the Minnesota court system. And even though the trial occurred in 1859 and her execution in 1860, questions still surround the case even today. And many that study the case do agree that at any rate, no matter what had been found then, at the very minimum, Anne Bilansky should have received a new trial. The case is unique because it did involve a woman named Anne Bilansky. She was accused and later convicted of poisoning her husband. But for a lot of reasons I won't get in here. It's, again, fascinating if you ever have a chance to read more about it. I've given different presentations on the topic, and it's just, I find something new every time I dive into it. But this case not only touched both Sibley and Ramsey in their times as governor, it also brought in all three branches of the Minnesota state government: executive, legislative, and judicial. It went all the way to the Minnesota Supreme Court. The legislature tried to intervene and commute her sentence, meaning it would be life in prison instead of death by hanging. The trial to convict her started under Sibley. She was convicted, and then the petition to have her sentence commuted or to completely exonerate her went to Alexander Ramsey. He said no. It's also interesting because Alexander Ramsey's brother, Justice, served on the jury, and one of the witnesses for the prosecution was Dr. Thomas Potts, who was the brother-in-law of Henry Sibley. And sadly, Anne Bilansky was hanged in March of 1860. And then this is the newspaper, The Pioneer and Democrat, announcing that. Many people were outraged, and even her lawyer, Willis Gorman, right up until the very end, he even was publishing articles in newspapers trying to rally the public to realize that this was a travesty of justice if it's carried out. Part of the reason a lot of people thought it was a fair sentence is because she also garnered some really poor press, and it's a case where politics intersected. It's a case where the power of the press came to play. It mirrors a lot of still the same topics that we hear today in our news cycles. So again, there's a reason to study history. Those patterns still reemerge. Even if they look a little different, some of the undercurrents are still there. So I at least wanted to mention the Anne Bilansky case because it also comes up specifically in Alexander Ramsey's letters and journals and his papers at MNHS. Well, Alexander Ramsey did try again to become state governor. He was successful. And at this point in time, Ramsey and Sibley would have had their careers intersect yet again, specifically then in 1862 with the US-Dakota War. When war broke out, or I should say when in August of 1862, when war broke out in Minnesota, after years of broken treaties and starvation on the reservations and tension between Dakota and settlers, Ramsey appointed Sibley general and sent him down to the area. So Ramsey knew Sibley could get the job done. Certainly, Sibley, it made sense. Sibley had some militia experience, but he had already proven himself in many ways to Ramsey. You know, again, going back to their time working so closely, congressional delegate, territorial governor. Sibley also would have had connections within the Dakota communities with also leaders, and so it did make sense. And yet another part of their careers that intersected, and also again, some people find them decisions and actions they took that may have been at the time what decisions would have been made as being such. Of course, very difficult to bear today in our modern day. On August 19th, this is what Alexander Ramsey wrote in his journal, and this is when he received intelligence about what was happening at the Lower Sioux Agency. He wrote that intelligence from the Lower Sioux Agency to the effect that the Sioux Dakota had murdered several persons. Also at Acton, Meeker County, several killed. Drove up to Fort Snelling and appointed Governor Sibley commander of the force. So that's what's notated in Sibley's journal. This is also from in the Ramsey archives at MNHS. It's another one that, even though it took a while to happen, this is alluding to when Sibley would have gotten his promotion, that when he had, it first had gone through in 1862, but it took forever to get through the Senate. By March of 1864, Alexander Ramsey's career kept going as well, and he was then Minnesota's U.S. Senator in Washington. That may have been part of the reason. I don't know if he was able to push that through more, but this is the letter that Sibley sent back thanking his friend, now Senator Alexander Ramsey, saying, "My dear sir, I have just received your telegram of the 22nd announcing my confirmation. The event is extremely gratifying to me. I am sure you do not need my assurance that I am not a man to ignore or forget the weight of the obligation. With renewed expression of thanks to yourself and through you to others who have labored in my behalf, believe me, very sincerely, your friend H.H. Sibley." Both men kept going forward in their careers. I already mentioned that Ramsey was a U.S. Senator. He served from 1863 to 1875 in that capacity. And Sibley became a very important civic leader. And he definitely stepped up during the early 1870s when the grasshopper plague was happening in the southern part of Minnesota. And a lot of his letters and papers in MNHS archives, again at the History Center, allude to that as well. So when Sibley stepped in, Sibley stepped in, and he served as the chairman for the St. Paul Chamber's Relief Committee. He coordinated the grasshopper relief activities for Governor Cushman Davis. He also, later on in the 1880s, helped coordinate relief efforts for an earthquake victims in South Carolina. So Henry Sibley definitely was giving back as well as part of his involvement in the community. And during the time then Minnesota was dealing with the grasshoppers, Alexander Ramsey involved himself as well. He notes in his journal that at the insistence of Governor Pillsbury, I called on him today and had a long conversation about the business of the convocation of governors who meet in Omaha in a few days on my locust question, and which he had some months since initiated at my insistence. Kind of still giving himself credit for planting seeds with Governor Pillsbury. We need to do something. We need to have some people meet. Let's have some governors of these states get together. And one thing that also is clear, that even if they weren't by the 1870s necessarily working closely together in politics, again, they were aligned in different ways, and they always commemorated their meeting in Mendota. And what I mean by that, Alexander Ramsey has notations in his journal, and I was excited when I stumbled upon this one night, because again, it humanized them, makes them real people. And I think that's important. Doesn't mean somebody's perfect, doesn't mean somebody's evil, but it makes them a real person. And there's a quote from Alexander Ramsey's journal dated May 27th, 1878. And this is what he wrote in his journal regarding him and Sibley. Quote, "This being the 29th anniversary of our landing in St. Paul and seeing General Sibley and his family subsequently at Mendota on same day, we invited the general to a glass of wine which he partook with us." So meaning that Anna and Alexander Ramsey invited Sibley to their home, and they would reminisce and remember how 20 plus years earlier, they had met in Mendota at about that same time. The next year, in 1879, Ramsey has pretty much the same journal entry. And this time it says, "This being the 30th anniversary of our landing at St. Paul in 1849, I had General Sibley over to take a bottle of wine with us." So I think that's, again, a way of humanizing both men and their families, and that even though Sarah had passed away by that point, Anna and Alexander Ramsey always still definitely entertained General Sibley. I mentioned that both of the men were very civic-minded, and they also were becoming conscious of their legacies by the 1870s, early 1880s. Both men were founders of and very active with the Minnesota Historical Society. This is from the St. Paul Globe, dated February 11th, 1879, and it's meeting minutes. And president here, and this right here, president of MNHS at that point, Henry Sibley, first vice president, Honorable Alexander Ramsey. Many times you will also see, Ramsey and Sibley listed together in the same event that happened. They'll be by each other in pictures. Years ago, I had a gentleman tell me that he had read a book a few years prior, and he really knew that Henry Sibley and Alexander Ramsey hated each other. They hated each other. They couldn't stand being around each other. And I'm like, well, I don't know. So where are you getting that from? And so we had a discussion, and I was listening to what he was saying and taking it in. Oh, okay, well, I can see where maybe you could assess that from those sources. But really, anything else that I see, primary source related, really shares that they were friends. At the end of the day, they were allies, they were rivals, they were friends, didn't always maybe get along, but there was never this deep division or spite that other people had. At the end of the day, they did get along. And I think that's, again, evident when they're working together in different organizations. The Minnesota Historical Society was very important to both of them. And I think for a variety of reasons, both of them were also starting to donate items from whether different papers from their time in politics or newspapers, other assorted artifacts. They were kind of starting to realize it was time to start shaping their legacy. And this is a photo, and you'll see a lot of these as well. The Old Settlers Association of Minnesota photos. And this is one that Ramsey had hanging in his office all the time. And so it's still, I think, is still in the office in St. Paul and at the site. But you'll see, I don't know, maybe you can see this. So Alexander Ramsey is right here, and Henry Sibley is right there. And many times when you see pictures like this, if Ramsey and Sibley are in the photo, 9 times out of 10, they are going to be right next to each other. I don't know if that was part the photographer wanted to pose them that way. Did they have agency to do that? I just always do find it really intriguing that if you find one, look to the other. Oh, yep, he's right there. They're right next to each other. So I mentioned they were becoming conscious of their legacies and contributions to history. And another reason they were working with different organizations and groups. Sibley started writing his autobiography. It wasn't ever published, but his work wasn't in vain. And I think here we go. But his work wasn't in vain. In 1889, an author named Nathaniel West, who was a young Presbyterian clergyman, agreed to write Sibley's biography. According to historian Rhoda Gilman, I don't know if any of you knew Rhoda. I had a few opportunities to meet her, and she was always just a gem, and I respect her work so greatly. And I just wanted to add this because I think this touches on it. So according to historian Rhoda Gilman, Nathaniel West didn't do a lot of research. He seems to have just compiled the work Sibley already did and published the biography under his name. And this is from Rhoda. This is a quote. Whatever his credentials for writing history, West lacked both talent and judgment. Now, the two books I have here, I guess the two pictures is of the same book, is of then the West biography of Henry Sibley that was published. And it's two I know of the copies are at the Ramsey House in St. Paul. And one is actually autographed by Sibley, and it's to his niece, Mary Livingston. And then the other one here is actually then autographed to Alexander Ramsey. And it's set, it's to Honorable Alexander Ramsey from his old friend Henry Sibley. And yes, and I think I have that right here. So you can see Sibley's handwriting, and he even says in there to his old friend, or from your old friend Henry Sibley. So I'll take that as another way of notating that at the end of the day, they did hold each other in high regard. Well, the end of an era. In 1891, sadly, Henry Sibley did pass away. Both men lived very long lives. I want to point that out. Henry Sibley passed away on February 18th, 1891 at the age of 80. Ramsey wasn't in Minnesota, and I realized that again when I was putting this presentation together last year. It never dawned on me that at that point in time, he was on a trade mission for Mexico or with Mexico. Even though he was a retired statesman, he had been appointed to different trade commissions. So the fact that Henry Sibley passed away and Ramsey wasn't even in the country just kind of struck me as a historian who kind of felt like she got to know parts of their lives. Governor Merriam, who was governor then in 1891, he put out the statement when Henry Sibley passed away, that it becomes my sorrowful duty to announce the death of the Honorable Henry H. Sibley, the first governor of the state of Minnesota. A long and useful career, public career involving positions of trust and of the highest order, is brought to a close in the demise of this illustrious and honored citizen. The greater portion of his life has been spent within the borders of the state he loved so well, and to whose service he devoted so much unselfish labor. The people of the Commonwealth will cherish the memory of his noble nature and generous deeds. Governor Merriam declared on the day of Sibley's funeral that all state offices be closed, the U.S. flag displayed at half-mast at the Capitol until sundown, and the building be draped with emblems of mourning for 30 days. Alexander Ramsey was an honorary pallbearer. But here is what the St. Paul Globe said. General Henry Hastings Sibley's glorious career extinguished by death, and the brave commander is gathered to his gallant fathers. And as the years went on, more and more of these, I guess you could say, elder statesmen in Minnesota history did pass away. Alexander Ramsey became one of the last ones to be alive. Since Ramsey was one of the last statesmen left, he started to receive correspondence like the following. And I thought this was an interesting way as we're kind of thinking about this. So in March of 1891, Ramsey received a letter from George Halstead. And the letter says, "Dear Sir, the recent deaths of Mr. William Windom and General H.H. Sibley, I thought, gave good names of worthy deceased citizens, as the Act of Congress of 1864 requires of any state sending 2 statues of her worthy dead to occupy positions in the Natural Statuary Gallery at Washington. I incorporated those names into a bill which I drew. A letter since then tells me that your friends are opposing the name of William Windom in your favor. They probably are not aware that you are ineligible because you yet remain with us, as you no doubt will for many years, as your friends most sincerely hope." The letter goes on to say how Halstead hopes Ramsey will not oppose William Windom's name and wounded grieving family. Halstead mentions his admiration for Sibley, himself having served in the military. So a few days later, Alexander Ramsey sent the following response. "My dear sir, I have your letter of the 3rd, and from its contents I learned for the first time of the purpose to place in the Old Hall of Representatives in Washington memorials of my recently deceased friends, Sibley and Windom, each of whom is worthy of such honor. No one has spoken to me on this subject, and so I think you must have been misinformed as to friends of mine opposing this measure. I make no pretensions to such that honor, and I have no merits which entitle me to it. And as you inform me that being still alive, I am not eligible, I am very glad of it, and yield my place to my deceased friends without hesitation. Very respectfully, Alexander Ramsey." Alexander Ramsey would outlive many in his circle, and there's a few more of Sibley, I realize so you can see how the newspapers would have remembered Sibley. From the St. Paul Daily Globe up in Princeton, Minnesota. Certainly people across the state would have known his name and been very sad at hearing the news of his passing. And here is then the funeral procession for Alexander Ramsey in 1903. So as I said, Alexander Ramsey outlived many in his circle and died on April 22nd, 1903, passing away at the age of 88. Both Sibley and Ramsey, along with their wives and other family members, are buried in Oakland Cemetery in St. Paul. Marion Ramsey Furness, Alexander Ramsey's daughter, wrote in her father's journal when he passed away. Since he wrote daily, she was going to mark an end of an era. So she wrote, "As the city clock struck 6, my dear father passed away." And it's interesting that she did that because Marion was very much the impetus for the preservation of so much of the Ramsey records. So not even his political papers that would, of course, MNHS would want to archive anyway, but everything he had in his collections, from newspapers to journals to letters to just daily notations, maybe nothing that would be considered earth-shattering, but would be important for historians to research, to have someday. And so it was very much Marian's wish that all of that would be saved. So I think it's, I'd say she was an amateur historian in her own right. Her father loved history. He conveyed that to Marian. She was also very involved in preservation, historic preservation work, just like her mother, just like Sarah Sibley. She had great women around her who she saw partaking in all of that, doing her share. So it just is interesting to think about Marian writing that, wanting to almost punctuate the end of her father's journal, and she would finish that day for him. The St. Paul Globe newspaper wrote about Alexander Ramsey, quote, "He died full of years and of honors, and that thought must temper grief. His life was well-rounded, his work completed, his duties all performed." So for 42 years, which is quite a while, 42 years, the lives and careers of Henry Sibley and Alexander Ramsey intersected. And it's apparent that at times they were rivals for political positions, no doubt. But at the end of the day, they had tremendous respect for each other. So this is a story I always think this is appropriate to end with. It shouldn't be surprising to anyone to learn that in 1903, shortly after her grandfather passed away, Anita Furness, Alexander Ramsey's oldest granddaughter, and they were, reminiscing about her grandfather. She was sharing different details, just like we do today when someone passes away, a family member is interviewed. And the reporter asked who her grandfather looked up to, admired, sought counsel from, enjoyed working with, or maybe even didn't see eye to eye with. And without hesitation, though, Anita answered to the idea of a friend. And she said, quote, "My grandfather's best friend was Henry Sibley." So looking at the patterns of history and also with what's going on even around us, I think that's important to remember that at the end of the day, that people like Henry Sibley and Alexander Ramsey, we may not always agree with, again, actions they took at the time, but that they did believe in their offices and they believed in the work that they did and wanted to do for the people of Minnesota. So I thank you very much for allowing me to join you this evening for this presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any, but I appreciate your time, I really do. And I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your evening and stay well and healthy. And I look forward to actually being able to do this in person. I will say again, thank you for your flexibility and patience because it's a very different feeling to give a presentation in this way than it is being all present together. So thank you, I do appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Jayne. You did wonderfully. It did not seem any more clunky or anything than it would in person. It just feels like that.
Very kind.
Especially since we can't hear the feedback as well. But we did get one question in during the presentation. So if you all have other questions, please type them out now and send them in that question and answer thing, and we'll answer them now. The first question was, how much did the fact they were members of opposing political parties play out in disagreements?
Oh, that's a good question. That's interesting because sometimes newspapers then would have a little more information about speeches they gave and things like that. But at the end of the day, their primary sources and I'm speaking specifically because I've had more access to the Ramsey primary sources, Alexander Ramsey is very, I'd say, professional about anything he writes about Sibley. Now there's some people, and he kind of, I think, would call a spade a spade. Like when his grandson had a birthday party and it was miserable, he wrote that in his journal. He's like, this was a miserable evening. He did not enjoy any of it. He also, called out the fact, I know that he couldn't stand President Johnson. He wrote freely about that in his journals. But even then, if he did have disagreements, let's say with someone specifically like Sibley, he didn't write about it. And so I don't know if it also was that they had, again, that they had that foundation, this is me being a psychoanalyst here, that they had that friendship foundation from 1849. And I don't know if I want to say like he had a soft spot for him, but I think there's people that maybe you know in one capacity, and then as your careers take you in a different way, you may go in different directions or acquire different tastes and different views, but you have that foundation to go back to. So maybe at the end of the day, you know, he's not a bad person, she's not a bad person, or you have that basic respect. And I know that sometimes even if you read books about personalities and things like that, they'll even say, experts will even tell you that if you have a solid foundation with someone to begin with, that way if you go off the rails at other points, you can both always remember, oh, we have this in common. Wait a second, we agree on this aspect of it, and that you trust each other. Maybe I'm really analyzing now, because maybe they really trusted each other and knew at the end of the day they were operating maybe different viewpoints, but with the right intent in mind. It wasn't only, I think they both wanted to go forward in their careers. I certainly know Ramsey did. He was always in the right place at the right time. But that with that inner circle, you still wanted to respect them. I know that Ramsey didn't like some of the other governors. I think he didn't like Cushman Davis, if I'm thinking correctly. So again, he was honest with the people he had problems or quarrels with. Some of that would carry over, but never with Sibley. A long answer, sorry about that.
That's great. We have another question here. They say, great work, and where are they buried?
They would be buried in Oakland Cemetery. I haven't been up there for so long, I'm embarrassed to say, but I know the Sibley, I know both Sarah and Henry would be buried there, and I know that in the case of the Ramsey family, Alex and Anna and also their grandchildren were buried there as well, along with their daughter Marianne. And Oakland Cemetery is in St. Paul. I should add that. Wonderful. And you can certainly go and visit. And if you, pardon me, sorry, listen, my eye is watering here. If you also are into history, which I would assume you are if you're joining us tonight, Oakland Cemetery is also a really, I mean this respectfully, a fascinating cemetery to visit and pay respects, because there's many names from Minnesota history that you will recognize as you walk through. So if you also are interested in that, it's a wonderful historic spot to visit. I want to, of course, mean to be very respectful, but it's fascinating when you recognize those names and see all of them there, lying in repose.
Wonderful. Another question here is, did Sibley ever break even in the 17 plus years he was working for the American Fur Company?
Oh, good question. I don't know if he did, but I wonder if part of that, and maybe this person even knows, maybe that's why they're asking. But that's my understanding, and I was rereading through this earlier again today, but some of his papers even allude to that that are in MNHS archives, that was part of what was another way of prompting him to want to take part in the treaty negotiations in 1851, because of still having such high stakes in the fur trade, and realizing that that would be a way now with these negotiations that the fur traders would be able to also get some money from this. I don't know if he did. It would surprise me if he did, but that is a great question, and I will go on record saying I don't know, and so I don't want to misspeak. It would be close, because I think a lot of them were owed a lot of money, or had lost a lot of money, I should say.
We don't have any open questions right now, but I have one, so
sure,
feel free to send some more in. We've got some time for that. I know research takes a long time, and while sometimes it sounds boring to others for the amount of hours we can spend researching, it can be boring at times, but it really is thrilling. What was a moment that was super exciting for you, or a little nugget that you always remember in this research process that just was exciting for you and helps you always want to keep researching and doing these things?
Oh, that is a fantastic question. Maybe in this case in particular, finding by accident, complete accident, and the piece I'm thinking of, I didn't actually find it for this presentation. I knew it existed, which is how I could incorporate it into the presentation. And it was something that I had even mentioned to Matt Carter at one point that I found, and this would be really fascinating because it cast Sibley and Ramsey in another light. I knew them as, you know, kind of that allies and rivals, but also more of this friend. That they were commemorating their anniversary of their meeting. And the fact that I just stumbled upon that one night when I was working at the Ramsey site, and I would always try to take little deep dives. I couldn't spend a lot of time, but just take different times in the day or even the week and just sit with Alex's journals and go through them. And that was one that totally floored me. And I remember it was around a day in May, because I was there late, but the sun was coming in, beautiful spring night. And then realizing that Alexander Ramsey is writing about how important that was, and that they would commemorate that. So 20 years later, or 30 years later, he and General Sibley would have some wine and honor the years since they had met in Mendota. And that it kind of blew my mind, because I didn't, when you research people a lot, you do start to feel like you know them. And I know that I don't think Sibley and Ramsey are perfect. I want to be very clear about that. Because I think they are fascinating individuals. I really do. And I've tried to think about how their minds work. And so to find that piece to really humanize them in what they thought of each other, probably in this case, that's the one that always sticks out. And in honor of our 30-year anniversary, let's have some wine. Oh, okay, I would have never had that on my radar. And that he took the time, that was his journal entry that day. It wasn't anything else with his wife. It wasn't another, event that had happened. That was the focus of that journal entry.
Wonderful, thank you for sharing that. 2 more questions here. I'm going to read the one that was related to that money question from previously.
Okay. Yeah, and if somebody knows, that's, please.
Yeah, they said, Gilman says he or the Sioux outfit owed more than $400,000 in 1851 to the American Fur Company, but they don't know if the treaties of 1851 changed this.
Oh, man, that would be fascinating to do the calculator right now to know how much that would be, because that sounds like a lot of money now. Or at least to me, in my world, much less than what that would have been in that era. So I don't know then if they would have been able to make that up. That's a really good question.
Yeah, and I think there was some made from that treaty, but again, I don't have the numbers here in front of me, so I'm not going to say anything for sure, but something that definitely could be looked into and figured out here.
So. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you to whomever asked that.
The next question is, what's available? What books and papers are available on these 2 men?
Oh, what a great question. I know that you probably have this one. I have it right here. The Divided Heart by Rhoda Gilman would be Sibley. I know that there's been a few more books. Oh, and the Helen White book. This slim one, again, I think I sell it at the Sibley site. That's where I got it years ago. So there's been different books that have been written on Sibley, but there's been nothing written on Ramsey. So that's something that's always bothered me, because especially with Ramsey, he kept a journal every day of his life. And MNHS has most of that. Same with letters. I mean, again, the Ramsey family saved everything. It is such a treasure trove for historians to go through, because you learn everything about their lives and you really do feel like you know them. There's also a great thing, it might sound odd, but, and I can also even send this in an email to Michaela, like a resource list too for people, if that would be of interest and maybe easier to do. But it sounds odd, but if you also just Google or go into MNHS collections, they're called the microfilm resource list. One is by, Helen White McCann did the one for Alexander Ramsey, and Porter, is it Jayne Porter, who did the one for Henry Sibley. Now, the reason I say those is because they'll give you the listing of what's available via microfilm or microfiche, Don't worry, you don't need that, because then they go into detailing and chronicling what is in all of this and then how that relates to their lives and the timelines. So in a way, those are like mini biographies. I was excited with the Ramsey one because it touches on a lot of his time in Washington, and especially then since he was our Reconstruction senator after the Civil War, voting with the radical Republicans on Reconstruction issues. It helped bolster what I was finding in Ramsey's journals about even African-American senators being seated, trying to get the Southern states back in, but the Southern states not wanting to come back in because they didn't want to ratify any the 14th Amendment, 13th Amendment, things like that. And Ramsey just writing in his journal for Southern states. And he was losing his patience because they were always in session till like 2 or 3 in the morning. And his wife, Anna, would even go into the galleries at times thinking, I'm witnessing history. And so then to have the journal, but then to have the microfilm, which I know sounds weird, but the microfilm papers back that up, that yes, that's what I should be seeing. And that's what he's writing a lot about in other things that MNHS has. So, and like I say, I'd be happy to actually send a resource list to Michaela and she could send that to interested parties.
Yes, I can definitely probably just send a mass email out to everybody who attended so they don't have to reach out, but it's always fun to get extra resources, and that's easy enough for me to do.
Yes, yes, certainly can. And like I say, off the top of my head, I probably will think of a few more. But, and it sounds weird, but those 2 microfilm guides, they are so fascinating. Again, if you are into history, which I think you are.
Yes. I think we'll do this one last, it's a bit of a question, but also probably a comment. And it says in 1854, the Ramsey investigation, it comes out that Ramsey refused to pay the Metawakan their annuities under the 1837 treaty. It would be interesting to find out how that was missed by the US Senate.
That's a great question. And I don't know if that really was missed by the US Senate. I don't know. It seems that there may have been things that were conveniently overlooked by the US Senate. I don't know. I wasn't there. But when historians have dug into that more, as this question raises, a lot of that was kind of in the open. It wasn't very hard to find. So I don't know. And I don't want to, I guess I'll just leave it with, that is a great question. And it would be fascinating to know more about that. One thing that I was even noticing again today when I was rereading some things, that was, I think, another reason that Sibley and Ramsey developed like a team atmosphere about them almost at times, because Sibley was the one in Washington he was called as a witness at one point, but also Ramsey would be letting him know of what to share to help his case, to help exonerate him. And Ramsey even notes in his journal that if it wasn't for the business of the Senate, this business with the Senate, I would not be here, meaning he would have already gone back east and started a different political career. He had name recognition at that point, but the Senate investigation is even what kept him here in Minnesota. So again, thinking he hadn't yet become state governor. So history could have been very different if he would have been found guilty or not had the career or even gone back east.
Yeah, those are great questions, and would involve more research, which is great. That's what we want. We want to find more things about.
When I wrote, there's a Minipedia article on Alexander Ramsey that I wrote, and I know when it was going through the editing process, that was something that came up, and that is why there is the tagline of, I'm not trying to think of how we even worded it, but essentially dealing with or sharing the fact that it's not overlooking evidence, but even with evidence that they saw, they did decide to exonerate her. But that would be a good way of taking a peek at that and even seeing. It's a very sad story and a very complicated story. And I, again, don't want to make anyone that I'm talking about tonight sound perfect, because they're not. Because history is, it's inspiring. History is also infuriating. But it's important to know about and learn about. So I'm really glad that some of these questions were asked tonight.
Yes, it's wonderful. It's great to learn something about history and then want to keep learning. That's
Yes,
a good
absolutely.
part of history.
And how we can do better, because that is also very important, because these patterns keep reemerging. And if it raises alarms with you, there we go. We shouldn't be doing that anymore.
Yes. I want to thank everyone for joining and for all of your wealth of knowledge, Jayne, the time it took to gather all of that and to present it so well. We really appreciate it. I enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone else here did as well. Thanks for joining us. If this is the first time you're joining the Dakota County Historical Society for a webinar, please join us again. We have a Mendota After Hours, which is what we call our webinar series. We used to meet at the Sibley House before COVID, and we'll do that again once we're able. But you can do webinars like this every month. And next month is on Pike Island on October 9th. So be sure to join us for that. Once you exit out of here, Zoom should pop up another browser tab so you can fill out a quick little survey. So it's less than 5 minutes, I'm pretty sure, for that survey. So if you have time for that, please do that. It helps us do more presentations like this. And thank you again to everyone who donated too. That is so helpful. We're able to keep doing these even with setbacks from COVID. So we really appreciate your support and getting creative during this time. So goodbye, everyone. Thank you, Jayne. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.